Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London, with me, Duncan Hewitt. The latest export tariffs imposed on China by the US government may only reinforce the trend for Chinese companies to seek new markets and new places to manufacture overseas, at a time when the Trump administration also says it wants to reduce China's global influence. One place where Chinese influence and investment has grown massively over the past decade is Africa, where China is now the biggest trading partner and provider of loans. Well, today we're looking at a new film that provides an unusually close-up insight into the reality of Chinese investment in Africa. Called Made in Ethiopia, it focuses on a Chinese-built industrial park in that country, and on characters including the Chinese deputy manager and the local villagers and workers who are affected by this industrialization. It's actually screening here at SOAS on February the 12th. Later, we'll be hearing from Professor Carlos Oya of SOAS, a specialist on China-Africa relations. But first, I'm joined by the documentary's directors, Xinyan, herself originally from China, and Max Duncan, who made the film along with Ethiopian-Canadian producer Tamara Dawit. Well, Max, you spent 4 years following these people's lives. What inspired you to do it?
We were both working, separately as journalists in China. I was originally with Reuters and Xinyan was with the BBC. And I think, at least from my perspective, a lot of what I covered during that time had one way or another something to do with sort of industrialization, urbanization, and those great big shifts that were taking place in China during that period and how they impacted individuals. And that was also the time, 2009, 10 onwards, when China really started expanding its sort of influence in Africa. And then that coincided with the Belt and Road Initiative, which was Xi Jinping's great infrastructure project, right? So it seemed like a really interesting time to explore China's global influence. And then Ethiopia specifically, had been called the China of Africa, because the growth model that it was using was so similar to China or the other sort of Asian tigers, the route that they'd kind of taken out of poverty. So big infrastructure, a low-cost manufacturing. And obviously Chinese investment in Ethiopia was so huge and so present. And so it just seemed like a fantastic place to go. I traveled there a couple of times, once for work and once for tourism. And it's just such an amazing country with its own very unique culture. Cultural preservation is also such an interesting subject in the context of development and progress. So it just seemed like a fascinating place to start looking.
And then these are themes that you very much brought out, because you not only focus on the big industrial park in this place called Duncan, which is a town, I believe, just sort of outside Addis Ababa, the capital, but also how it affects the people in the surrounding area and the villagers who eventually may have to move to make way for phase 2 of this industrial park. So how did you come across this specific story, and how easy was it to get people to talk and to get the participants to agree to be in the film?
When we took the first trip to Ethiopia, it wasn't easy. Originally, we really wanted to focus on this one giant shoe company. This is when Trump was just coming into picture. And I remember the first time I heard about this big shoe factory in Ethiopia was when Ivanka Trump was making shoes with this company. And I read some news report about Huajian, this name of this company, was moving a lot of its order to Ethiopia. And they had very interesting style of management, having this very Chinese, somewhat militaristic management style. People wake up early and sing a song. And so I think we went there hoping to kind of learn more about what's going on. And I think what we saw was quite overwhelming at first, because you just see Chinese investment everywhere. There's like people who are collecting old bottles, turning them into plastic, and there are people who are selling cement. There are people who are Ethiopians who have learned Chinese, selling vegetables to Chinese people who are building wells and building roads. And so you just see this very intricate web of Chinese investment kind of everywhere in Ethiopia. And I think it was really interesting for us to experience, because there wasn't much Western influence. You don't really see McDonald's or KFC or hear any music that was Western, but you do see um, Chinese influence a lot. And I remember when we first went, they would also, a lot of people would shout at us and they would say, China, China, money, money. So we did go and talk to this shoe company, but they were not really ready for a documentary to be shot. But we did go to many events, and at one of the events, we kind of went with Moto, and this is when we were first learning about her, and we decided to go to this event, and it was just amazing how passionate she is about being in Ethiopia.
Tell us a bit more about her. So Moto is the deputy manager of the Eastern Industrial Park in Duquesne, and
Yes.
she has actually been in the country for quite a few years before working for this Chinese industrial zone.
Yeah, she was actually in Tanzania before, and she's been in Ethiopia for 15 years or longer. She was in tourism business for many years, and she was kind of known by the local Chinese community as this really charismatic person who speaks local language and who has good connections with the local officials. So when we were there, it was the first time she took over as the deputy manager. I think part of what the park wanted to do was to hire someone that, is actively liaising with Ethiopian officials and Ethiopian investors. I think they wanted to change their image. A lot of times Chinese communities are seen as pretty introverted and keeping to ourselves and not really interacting with others. So she stood out as someone who's very, very unique to us. She was so enthusiastic in presenting this park as this poster child of Chinese investment. So we were really infatuated by her with her passion. She has this very firecracker kind of personality who's like a tornado. And so we wanted to really see where her passion is going to take us. So that's when we started the journey. And she did a lot of work in inviting us into this environment because she had this very open-minded approach because she speaks a local language, she speaks English. She had this very transparent attitude. She's like, a lot of misunderstandings stem from us being pretty closed off. So I'm going to allow you to come see how we're running this park. And, there are problems and there are benefits. And all I wanted you guys to do is to reflect on this objectively.
Because what we see is a very multifaceted picture, and I think just as you say, Xinyan, that Motto, whose name is Ma Futao, what she talks about a lot is her concern and her commitment for Ethiopia, and how she wants to give young people in Ethiopia a chance, and it really presents this picture of a country which, as I think one of the visiting Chinese entrepreneurs says when he goes to one of the factories, it's just like China 20 or 30 years ago. So they see a place with lots of potential, with lots of young people who probably coming from rural areas, like even Motto herself had come from a rural area, she tells us, but who want to, improve their lives. So there's a lot of talk about dreams and things like that. How did the reality kind of pan out in terms of, all these idealistic things that people talk about at the beginning of the film, because you follow their progress over several years from sort of 2019 to 2023?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important question for our film because, when we started it in 2019, Ethiopia was in this position where it had been growing at sort of around 10% GDP growth for over a decade, thus the kind of China of Africa moniker. And Abiy Ahmed had taken over the previous year as prime minister, and there was a lot of hope there on the sort of rule of law and democracy front because he'd released a lot of people from prison. He'd sort of liberalized the media, allowed sort of rebel leaders from opposing groups to come back to Ethiopia, and there was so much kind of optimism, from the Chinese perspective as well. The Chinese sort of had established this long-term partnership with the Ethiopian government, and they sort of really felt like they understood each other. So there was so much kind of positive energy. And I think to some degree, going in and starting the project was almost just a fascination of, as Xinyan mentioned, you didn't see much Western stuff. There was so much, it was like a whole world growing, a whole relationship growing without the presence of the West. So it felt very kind of optimistic. And then quite quickly into our filming, the pandemic hit in 2020, and that was sort of the beginning of a almost sort of a cascade of problems that happened in Ethiopia. The pandemic obviously had a huge impact on global supply chains. At the end of 2020, then a civil war erupted between the central authorities and the leadership of the Tigray region, which had a massive impact on investor confidence and on the exchange rate, inflation, a whole load of knock-on problems that basically changed the economic situation and the investment climate so dramatically in the space of 2 years, basically. And it was just happened that, the period we were filming straddled that period. And I think, those big events that happened, and the sort of downturn economically exacerbated perhaps a lot of existing problems, labor relations, the ongoing land appropriation problem that you see, essentially around compensation. And
yeah, I mean that's a big part of the film, isn't it? Perhaps
it
we'll
is.
come back to it a bit in a few
Sure.
minutes. But basically, they want to expand the industrial park to
Right.
have a phase two. But there are 80 plus people who live on that land, and they are promised compensation, and then they say that the local government hasn't given it to them, and it becomes a real kind of impasse where the Chinese side are very frustrated and they want to push the local government, but the villagers are fed up with everyone. But as you say, we also see the impact of the civil war and the fact that the orders suddenly drop off, and so we go from actually what seems like quite an optimistic picture at the beginning of the film,
Yeah.
with the young workers talking about their dreams and how they can realize them, and it really sort of turns into something much less hopeful, you might say, as the film goes on. I mean, did that surprise you with the way it developed?
Actually, it did not surprise me because I sort of lived through this as a
Mm.
child, and I feel like a lot of things that we've seen in Ethiopia were reminding me of what was going on in China. There's this boom of real estate development, this boom of industry, and taking the land. And as journalists, we have covered so many stories of local government trying to grab the land and with compensation that many people didn't think it was enough. And so the clashes between people who own these lands and local governments and these real estates developers were not uncommon at all. And there are other things like environmental problems and in China. So what really intrigued me was the similarities between China and Ethiopia. And Betty reminded me of young women who felt liberated by industrialization in a way. In China,
Mm.
a lot of younger women came to Shenzhen, came to Dongguan, and they had independence and they learned English. And some people really rose out of their poverty-stricken situation.
So Betty was one of the young women who came to work in
Yes.
the factories in the industrial park. And had she come from far away, actually? Had she come from a rural area? Because
Yes. If you look at Duncan from our film, you'll see how little resource they have, but where she's from is even farther and also pretty conflict-stricken places. So they had a government labor transfer program that Betty came with, and from words of mouth as well. Betty had a lot of people who came from the same hometown with her. So interestingly, that factory actually did not hire many people from neighboring towns. So farmers felt like they did not really benefit from them.
one of the striking things about the film is the very kind of intimate portrait of all the people involved. So from the motto running the industrial park, to Betty and some of her friends who are young workers looking for a new future. And she talks a lot about, she wants to leave her family and she wants to do something different. And then you have the mayor of the town, you have the people in the village, and Warkanesh, the female farmer who's keen to actually have a new life, whereas her husband very much wants to stay on the land, and she talks about how the men don't want to change. So you've really given us a quite an in-depth picture where people are not stereotypes. Some of the Chinese people obviously are saying, oh, these Ethiopians need to work harder, but then you have people like Motto, who is really very sympathetic most of the time to what Ethiopian people are feeling and what the background of the country and the problems they face. How did you go about sort of presenting such a varied picture?
I think definitely like the sort of starting principle of this film was that it would be a multi-perspective film. You want basically to everybody in the film to be able to express their motivation for why they do things. And I think that's where hopefully a lot of this kind of, we sort of break some of the stereotypes because you get to understand why a person does the thing they do. So that was always something that we wanted to show. And I think it's one of the big successes of the film. And it's something that when people respond to the film, people really bring out that they really appreciated hearing all those different sides. I think the makeup of our team was really helpful in actually gaining people's trust because it wasn't just Ethiopian or just Chinese or just European white. I think the fact that we came as this sort of multi-ethnic, multi-perspective group really helped.
And one of the things that's quite striking in the film is this sort of quite iconic tree on the land close to the village where these people live, and it's a tree that has a sort of sacred significance, and the locals perform lots of ceremonies there, and that seems to be a really a powerful way of showing the local culture that is in danger of just being kind of steamrolled, presumably, by this kind of development.
What really fascinated me was, where Ethiopia is at this cusp of going into industrialization from an agricultural based economy, and farmers were presented with an option to become workers. And I think what surprised me is that there are many different opinions among villagers. So we chose this one particular family because it was representative of the kind of divided opinions of how they felt about progress or prosperity. In Wakinash's eyes, she's this very progressive woman who really wanted to break away from this land, what it represents. At the same time, the husband, Adunia, he represents what this land means, and he toils on the land, and we filmed him, time and time again with teff, the main grain that they grow. It's a very back-breaking labor, So I think from Adunia, we really see that side of when you are kind of left behind by development. So through them and their marriage and their divided opinion, I think we wanted to present this picture of very complex reaction because, like Betty, some people, and surprisingly and very interestingly, women benefited a lot from industrialization.
Overall, Max, did you feel that as the process went on, did you feel that the two sides were coming to understand each other better? The Chinese companies or the Chinese people working there and the locals, because we see a few nice examples, where obviously Motto, who has been there for a long time, she gets on very well with some of the Ethiopian people she works with. We also see one scene of a Chinese woman who works in one of the companies sitting with a young Ethiopian woman, and they're showing each other photos of their families and having a good conversation both in English. So clearly some bridges were being built. But what's your feeling sort of after spending several years there? Do you feel that this Chinese investment is ultimately going to make China popular in these parts of Africa?
It's a really, really difficult question. Of course, on an individual level, there are relationships built. People get married. New generations are born. We show a wedding in the film. Between a Chinese factory supervisor and an Ethiopian worker. Which is sort of we used at the beginning of the film as a sort of symbol of this question, right? It's a marriage between two countries, and to what degree is it love? To what degree is it convenience? So, I mean, on the individual level, I think, we have obviously seen quite a lot of cultural misunderstanding and some kind of cultural understanding. I think the question about the big level, there's certainly more agency than from the Ethiopian side than is described in a lot of the sort of mainstream reporting or discussion of China-Africa. And, Ethiopia had a very clear idea of what it wanted to get out of China, in terms of this sort of aid with basically in industrializing, right? Ethiopia is also a country with a very restricted media culture and a restrictive political system. So it's harder to say, for example, how popular China is. I think we definitely experienced that people appreciate the very concrete benefits that they can see from Chinese investment. So infrastructure, airport, road, all of this stuff. People see that Chinese do stuff, and I think they really appreciate that. And they built the Africa Union headquarters and the new airport and, pretty much everything, all the big buildings in the center of Addis Ababa. So to some degree, China, does represent a kind of modernity. And I think people like to see progress, this kind of very visible progress. I think there is obviously also suspicion, and there are concerns about a sort of unbalanced power dynamic. And I think in a country, if you look at Kenya, which is, neighboring country and has in some ways quite a similar relationship with China. There are quite a lot of parallels, but it has a very free political environment and a very free media environment. There's a lot more sort of critical reporting on China and a lot more sort of public expression of concern than you see in Ethiopia.
You do show some areas of sort of tension, shall we say, to say the least. And there's one scene in a factory where the Chinese factory manager is telling the female workers that they need to work much harder and that they waste far too much time sort of walking slowly and taking long breaks and all kinds of things like that. And we also see that in fact Motto leaves her job, and so by the end of the film, she's decided to go into coffee exporting instead. So that kind of perhaps makes us feel that this project is not necessarily going to have a smooth future. But what was your feeling? I mean, do you think that this type of project is still going to be an important part of China's role in Africa or in countries like Ethiopia in the coming years?
I think what we learned from making this film is a lot of factors contribute to the success of this model, right? It's just there's one the deputy manager, the Ethiopian deputy manager of the park in the film. He was someone who greatly benefited from Chinese investment. His two children are now studying in China, and he came from a poor region, and he's made something for himself. And he had this reflection in the film, and he said that if only every level of the Ethiopian society worked together, from officials to the Chinese and to the farmers and the workers. He said that there was no secret. You only have to work hard. And so then he let out this long sigh at the end. I think that he was someone who was kind of stuck in the middle, and in his eyes, there's just no it's very simple. You work together and you deliver. But sadly, the reality is a lot more complicated. Like I said, what we know is that phase 2 has gone ahead. They've officially opened it, but because of the local economy, the fact that Ethiopian birr, the local currency, is really not very stable, and so it gave a lot of difficulties for Chinese to buy ingredients from China and then produce it in Ethiopia and sell it in local currency, and not really making back what they've invested. So, and on top of that, the political instability really made people worried about the future of the economy. So the phase 2 now don't really have many factories occupying the space. And so I think in a way we were trying to reflect on the path of prosperity. The important thing is the fruit of people's labor. I think people like Betty and Wakinash, they have no problem working hard, but I think in a way they were disillusioned because of the fruit of their labor weren't really protected by the system. So all these labor protests, Chinese managers were questioning the integrity of some of the Ethiopian workers in the film. But in the end, I think I really understand where they're coming from. If you're making $50 a month and the local currency is so volatile, and the next month it's only worth $25, yeah, and there's no point in working overtime because the money you earn is going to be worth nothing. So I think in the end, I really understood the disillusionment from both the farmers and the workers, because they've given so much to pitch into this very grand dream of industrialization, but they didn't really benefit much from it.
I guess one thing that maybe does come out of this film is that, as you say, I mean, in a place like Ethiopia, there's a huge amount of Chinese involvement. There's not that much apparent Western involvement. We see one group of Dutch businessmen who come to visit the industrial park. and seem astonished by what, how developed it is actually. I mean, it's a massive place with sort of 20,000 workers.
Yeah.
In a sense, does what you saw make you feel that China in some ways is taking Africa a bit more seriously than many Western countries are? The Chinese, Xinyan, as you've suggested, they look at Ethiopia, and a place like Ethiopia, and they think, oh, well, this is kind of what China used to be like, so why can't we do what we did in China? Is there a sense that they do actually believe that Africa can achieve something, that they're not just coming to exploit it?
It seemed very clear that China views Africa as an opportunity. If you have Chinese companies like this phone maker, Xinyan, who has a brand called Techno that produces phones only for the African market, and they've been doing that for a decade. They have never sold a phone in China or anywhere else in the world, and they have special functions that are specific to African skin color and the way that Africans use their phones. They have a camera basically that exposes your background lower for darker skin, because often if you take a selfie and it auto exposes, the skin tends to brighten, but then the background gets very blown out. I don't see many Western brands who are sort of thinking in the same way. China looks at Africa and sees 1.5 billion potential consumers, right? I think in a way that we don't in the West don't necessarily think of Africa quite in the same way. And obviously, from a strategic perspective, China takes Africa very seriously, on a political level, right? Because it wants friends. And that relationship is definitely going to go on strong, even if, for example, in our film, we've seen through a very difficult economic period, and the business people may not want to invest in Ethiopia in the same way in the long term. I don't think personally that China's strategic goal will change there at all. I think it'll only increase.
And Xinyan, did you have a thought on that?
Originally, I think one of the biggest questions I had was, you hear a lot of stories about China being strategic about its investment. If it's not making money, then it must be strategic. And we hear about these debt traps, and some of the scholars have pointed out that a lot of these projects that are not successful are not really due to strategic or wanting to keep Chinese influence there. Is because there are also a lack of experience investing in Africa, and some of them are not really good at reacting to the bigger investment environment. If you look at Duncan, it's extremely harsh investment environment, and you really have to play the local rules. So I think going forward, it's clear from these conferences I've gone to in the U.S. There were African leaders who came, who made it really clear. We want to chart our own path. We do not want to just take the China way or the American way or the European way. So I think it's really interesting to see where some of the countries are going to do in the future, knowing that there's no perfect model, and I'm really interested in seeing whether what China is doing is going to really lift people out of poverty in the global South. So I think this is something that hopefully when Chinese people watch this film, they also reflect on, is how do we build. We should not just be aiming for quick benefits. We should not just be aiming for immediate profit. How do we build structures that really leave a legacy for local people, that they can continue generating wealth for the locals? Moto is someone who do believe in long-term vision, and she loves the idea of building schools and hospitals. But then I do think that there is this tendency to look more in the short term. And I think a lot of Chinese companies are still learning what corporate responsibility means. And even though there are people like Malto who have that vision, it's going to take a long time for Chinese companies to really put that into their vision.
Well, Xinyan Yu and Max Duncan, thank you both very much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thanks, Duncan.
Thank you, Duncan.
We're joined now by Professor Carlos Oya, head of the Department of Development Studies here at SOAS and author of the forthcoming book, Global China for Africa's Industrialisation. Carlos, thank you very much for joining us. I'm afraid the audio quality on your line is not perfect, but we'll do our best. You've seen this film. How representative would you say it is, both of the type of Chinese investment that's going into Africa and also of the relationship between the Chinese side and the locals?
Yeah, I think it's a very good representation of the kinds of dynamics that you find in many kinds of Chinese investments across the continent, particularly within the manufacturing sector. These investments tend to be from private enterprises. Many of these enterprises tend to be small, medium-sized, quite often family-run businesses. Obviously, not many countries in the continent have received the volume of such investments as Ethiopia. Perhaps Nigeria would be another example. So they go there in the search for markets, in the search for platforms from which they can export. In the case of Ethiopia, the fact that Ethiopia is a country that has developed an industrial strategy, has a large market, and also is a country that has access to AGOA. This is the Africa Growth Opportunity Act. At the time that Chinese investments arrived, AGOA, which was essentially a free trade arrangement with the United States, was active. Later on, when the war broke out in 2020, eventually the AGOA arrangement was suspended by the US government.
I mean, in the film, we see, examples of both the kind of opportunities that this Chinese investment can create in Africa, but also some of the potential for misunderstandings and problems and sort of culture clashes even. How much has that affected Chinese economic links with Africa?
What the film essentially documents and shows, and I think it's an important part of the story, is the issue of land and the fact that some of these ventures, especially industrial park that requires land in order to be developed, usually implies a reallocation of people. Obviously, the way this is portrayed in the film shows some of the complications in this process when, for example, the local government, or in the case of Ethiopia, also the federal government, are not able to sort of implement the arrangements as initially agreed. And partly that shows the fact that these private companies are not able to be in charge of the whole process. They need to work with governments, particularly with local governments, that sometimes do not operate at the same speed they would like to see.
We hear a lot about China's relationship with Africa in the context of a great sort of strategic push by China for influence in that part of the world. But as you say, there are a lot of private companies involved. I mean, how much are they doing this, just voluntarily as a commercial decision, and to what extent are they getting, encouragement or support to go to Africa as part of this Chinese government strategy?
These are certainly private ventures, and they only do these if it's commercially viable from the point of view. I have not seen a single example of one of these private companies being pushed by the Chinese government in any direction. In fact, in the Ethiopian case, which I think the Ethiopian case is quite interesting because actually a primary driver was the efforts made by the Ethiopian government itself in trying to bring as many investors as possible, not just from China, but also from other parts of Asia. In essence, the role of the Chinese government with private enterprises is actually much more limited than people tend to assume. Obviously, the Chinese government has welcomed delegations like the ones coming from Ethiopia and has facilitated the kinds of links that they needed to meet the business sector in China itself.
You're saying that, for example, Ethiopia would send a delegation to China and actually look for companies to come and invest.
Absolutely, and this might be facilitated perhaps by a provincial government in China, like Guangdong, other provincial governments that want to strike some partnerships with African countries as part of the broader attempt to foster more links with African countries. But in essence, the private companies really needed to be persuaded. And the main element of that persuasion was the proactiveness of the Ethiopian government in pushing that process. So Ethiopia in that sense is, I would say, an exception. The norm has been what's happened to countries like, say, Nigeria or Angola, where you do see Chinese private firms investing, but primarily what these Chinese private firms do is to exploit potential advantages of accessing those local markets. it makes economic sense for them to, rather than export whatever they were exporting from China, to move some of those operations and to set up plants in countries like Nigeria or Angola, where there is a potential profitable opportunity just through the access to those markets.
But presumably the Chinese government is very willing to provide loans to Chinese companies to support their expansion into Africa.
That's not the case. In fact, most of the loans, they tend to be dedicated to the development of infrastructure, which essentially what they do is provide credit to African governments so that they can implement all kinds of infrastructure projects. In those cases, you do see Chinese firms going into African countries. These are quite different. These tend to be state-owned enterprises in the construction sector. They come to these countries to essentially provide construction services. In some cases, like in the Ethiopian Industrial Park, the one that is portrayed in the film, there was some limited funding from a provisional government. That the central government and the big development agencies like China Development Bank or Exim Bank rarely really target these small, medium-sized private firms in terms of the funding.
You raised this question of China's lending and credit to Africa. China is now sub-Saharan Africa's largest trading partner and creditor, I believe. And Xi Jinping last year at this forum in Beijing promised a further 50 billion in funding for Africa over the next few years. How much is that having, the effect that China desires and that the African countries themselves desire? We do hear of cases of problems with debt traps and, concerns about those kind of issues.
The most significant tangible effect of a lot of these funding is that infrastructure projects that have been starved of finance for decades have now received some funding for the first time. So
in Africa.
In Africa. So there's a tangible effect in the sense that there has been quite a substantial infrastructural development, especially in power generation and distribution, as well as in transport and communication, and also one would argue ICTs. This basic economic infrastructure is actually absolutely fundamental for the prospects of economic transformation. And it's really the first time that we see a creditor providing a substantial share of that lending to these sorts of infrastructure projects. On these risks of debt trap, I would refer to the work of Deborah Brautigam and other colleagues in Johns Hopkins University, where they have debunked the idea that generally this has led to substantial degree of debt distress across different countries. It is clear, however, that it is partly a contributor in some cases. However, the problem with this kind of narratives is that what people tend to forget is that African governments do not just take credit from China. Even if China has become maybe the leading creditor in some of these countries, the reality is that they take in credit from a range of sources. Interestingly, the cases of countries that have gone into more serious trouble, like Zambia or Ghana more recently, where there was a debt default, in those cases, the main problem was the fact that they went to the financial markets and they went for bond emission at a time where they were already quite stretched in terms of the lending operations. And this has indeed been picked up by some Chinese lending institutions, which have seen that the risk has increased in a number of countries. So you could see from the statistics that the volume of lending from China has been substantially reduced since 2020. These promises of 50 billion funding, etc., that they tend to bundle all kinds of different sources of funding and investment. So they may include private investments, but then you have to really unpack them.
Overall, do you feel that China's interest in Africa is undimmed, or has it been affected by some of the problems that we've also seen reported? There have been protests over some Chinese companies or sort of pipelines and some of the infrastructure projects. Does Beijing still see Africa as a vital partner? Yeah,
I think so. I think most there are plenty of indications that Africa remains strategically really important for China's geopolitical agenda. We need to also consider that there's a long history of these relations. This is not something that has happened overnight. I think what we probably see at the moment, and partly because of the pandemic and the geopolitical upheavals of current times, there will be some rebalancing in terms of the terms of this engagement. So, for example, there may be less focus on large-scale credits for large infrastructure projects because of the lending risks. You need to bear in mind that these are lending institutions. They're not just giving away grants. They're also commercially oriented. They need to make some profit after all. And of course, they do follow some guidelines, some directives from the central government in terms of supporting African countries so that they have access to this finance, but within reason, within limits. And I think you could see some mentions of sort of smaller scale type of infrastructure interventions, slightly different from what we saw in the previous decade. It doesn't mean that they're going to stop the funding of ports or railways or industrial parks. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that the volume of all that is likely to be at a different scale from what we saw in the 2010s and before the pandemic hit.
One thing we're hearing a lot about at the moment is American foreign policy and where that might be changing in the coming years, and presumably African countries will be significantly affected by some of the changes to USAID and slashing of its budget. Does that give China sort of more potential to get involved and to gain influence in Africa?
The potential is there. There's no doubt. I mean, especially if USAID pull out in the way that the current events seem to suggest, this is going to send shockwaves in the aid industry, and clearly there can be a backlash. These kinds of fractures relationship between the US and African governments and African countries certainly provide a bit of geopolitical clout to China in the continent.
Obviously, China's involvement in Africa covers a whole range of areas, and we've seen, for example, the setting up of various Chinese media companies' headquarters in places like Nairobi, where you've got the CGTN, Chinese television. You've had the Xinyan news agency, and they've been very much trying to make inroads into the African media market. After all these years, all this investment, and obviously some of the tensions that we see in the film. Do you think that China is actually winning hearts and minds among the African people, or is there actually a sort of growing backlash?
Well, the evidence seems to suggest, if you take the Afrobarometer and some of these surveys of attitudes, on balance, I think China's image has substantially improved over the years. So even despite the evidence of some localized backlash in certain places, and the fact that it's true that sometimes Chinese firms and other Chinese actors have received some bad media image, I think this is probably changing over time. But I think more importantly, what you see from this surveys of ordinary citizens, the image is pretty positive. And given what's happening now, with Trump and others, it's quite likely that China's image is probably going to improve further. I don't see actually a substantial backlash coming up, and quite the contrary.
Professor Carlos Oya, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context from the SOAS China Institute.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's all we have time for in this edition. A reminder that Made in Ethiopia is showing here at SOAS in London on the 12th of February at 5:15. And you can find more information about that and all our events on our website, soas.ac.uk. For now, from all of us at the SOAS China Institute, thanks for listening and goodbye.